Hello and welcome to Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we will be discussing the challenge rating system in D&D, and more specifically whether or not it really has any place in modern D&D, as a lot of people find it to be pointless or inaccurate or just a tool for less competent DMs. There's a lot of debate around this one and specifically where it belongs in the rules hierarchy of how necessary it is. I'm going to kick it off to Ben first.
Yes, challenge rating sucks. Don't use it. Thank you for watching. Like, share, comment, and subscribe for more. So, here's the thing with challenge rating that I think is what people miss. And this has come up for me personally very recently. Mara's in a party with two other players, a ranger, a bard, and a druid. That is the party. And I've had them fight things that were way above their CR, and they mop the floor with these monsters. Now, here's the problem. The original, like back in the day D&D and just RPGs in general, you had the basic 4-member party. It was a fighter, a cleric, a rogue, and a wizard or mage healer of some, magic user of some kind. So that is what CR is based on. It's based on you're going to be fighting those things. So for example, if you come across the monster called a Rakshasa, they are immune to magic below a certain level unless they choose to be. They are immune to non-magical attacks. And they have a fairly high CR because there's this premise that the fighter and the rogue are not going to be able to harm this creature without a lot of help from one of the other party members. And you have the reverse. You have, for example, creatures with legendary resistance, which theoretically can render something like a wizard or a bard useless because whatever spell saves they have to make, they can just choose to succeed. If your bard is College of Valor, or your wizard is a blade singer, then that changes the equation a lot. And we have all of these sort of hybridized classes that really warp how the CR works. You have things like Eldritch Knight Fighters and Arcane Trickster Rogues. And as much as everybody likes to dump on Rangers, the fact is, like the Horizon Walker Ranger and the Gloomstalker Ranger are pretty tough and pretty good in a fight. And especially after, if they get high enough levels to where they've got spell slots to use, basically, they are better than the basic fighter that the challenge rating system was designed around.
Yes, and the other issue that comes to mind is the diversity of magic now. In the old days of D&D, and I'll preface this with I didn't play the old days. I think I've played one session of 3.5. So, but in the old days of D&D, from my understanding, you had, say, Fireball, which did magical fire damage, and then you had a sword, which just did piercing or slashing damage, depending. Nowadays, you can have a sword with magical damage that is just a cantrip. I think there is literally, Green Flame Blade literally just makes your weapon magical if you choose. And then later levels, there's also a spell called Holy Weapon, which wizards and clerics alike can use, which is quite potent. Similarly, if you want to go the other way with that, the Alter Self spell can give you natural weapons which don't count as magical, so a sorcerer could cast that on themselves, and have claws which do non-magical but quite dangerous damage. And so there's this versatility to magic, which just wasn't there before, and I think that's a large part of why, especially in the newer books, every single subclass has something to do with magic now, is because you really need that versatility. But it also, challenge ratings are meant for, a sword can never be magical unless it's a very high-level object, and a firebolt can never not do magical damage. And the rules are changed already. Sorcerer alone can easily manipulate the rules of every spell in the book. So.
And the other thing that comes up a lot in these situations is if the players know what they're going to be up against, they're going to tailor what classes they take, what spells they take, and just generally how they sort of put their character together. So, for example, if you're running Curse of Strahd, your players are all going to come up with ways to do damage, things like radiant damage, or spells that make sunlight. There's some confusion over which spells it is that actually make actual daylight. Hint, the spell called Daylight doesn't make daylight.
I know, it's very infuriating.
Topic for another time. But the point is, if you're running a campaign against undead, the party's gonna load up on ways to do radiant and fire damage that will just be very effective against undead, which is going to make it much more difficult for the CR to work out, because if you've got a vampire and everybody in the party is doing the damage that vampire is vulnerable to, and everybody in the party has tailored their characters to be able to deal with it, the CR is not going to be reflective. One way to get around this is if you're doing like a monster of the week type scenario, which is just the players are coming up against something different every week. To be honest, I've never found those kinds of campaigns all that compelling. It's just hard to really dig into it. Some other options you have for doing this, as always, I'm a fan of giving higher CR monsters some kind of allies that go with them that maybe don't have the same weaknesses. So, for example, a vampire might have a Renfield type character, some human minions who he hasn't started to change yet, and they could be helping the vampire in the course of the fight. I'm really not a fan of giving monsters the spell Counterspell. Based on that sigh, I'm guessing Mara's not either, because it feels, even though it is a legitimate thing to do, like, right, I can't really tell you you're wrong for doing this. It just feels like a cheat. It feels like you're stealing the fun from the game. One thing you can do is give the monster some magical items. So, for example, if the players are whipping out fire and daylight and all this other stuff that harms the vampire, perhaps he has some sort of magical darkness he can drop on to sort of nullify that, as well as healing artifacts that that bring him back to full health.
Yes, and the other thing to add to that is, especially for bosses, add minions, because the current state of the game means the action economy is completely broken and worthless. Let's just be honest here. For the monsters, especially, I had my party that I DM for fight something called a Boneless from one of the new books, and Ravenloft, I think. Anyway, it has a challenge rating of like 14 or something ridiculous like that. And these guys tore it apart. But the thing is,
we were level 1.
Yeah. And that's because the action economy is so garbage. Had it had equal turns to you guys, I highly doubt you would have won. Or had I added 2 of them coming from opposite directions so the party's attention was divided. I think I've referenced this before. I'm going to do it again. There's a game called Other Side. The first boss is a plague doctor. He summons minions who boost his armor, so you have to kill these guys to stop him from boosting his armor further. It's a big part of the game. It makes it a lot harder to deal with this guy. Once those minions are gone, the boss is actually kind of a pushover. It applies to D&D to have a few minor vampires who are like, say have Strahd, right? You have Strahd, have him summon a minion who, while that minion is in existence, Strahd is not damaged by sunlight or silver or whatever it is. And then you kill that minion, and Strahd is suddenly a lot weaker. That adds a whole new layer to the game. It makes the action economy actually far more interesting, because you really do have to focus on different targets.
Now, as DM, it's really important that you drop some hints that this is why the sunlight or the silver or whatever it is isn't working. You need to, in the interest of fairness, you need to give your party plenty of clues that this is what they need to do. And as a DM, it's always fun to watch the party completely miss every single one of those clues and continue to attack the monster with spells that aren't working.
We got all 3 of your hints. I actually left 7,241 hints, but your feeble brains only managed to comprehend 3 of them.
Yeah, DMing can kind of suck sometimes, or be great depending on your view. Also, be aware of what your players can do. It's a lot of DMs, I don't know why, but I always feel awkward asking people for their character sheets and spell lists. Don't. Have those in mind when you are designing encounters. I had a DM years ago who, in designing an encounter, he figured that my character would be just about useless because my character was a battle master fighter, multi-classed with an assassin rogue. So no non-magical, no magical weapons. Because my character was a battle master fighter, the monster we were fighting was immune to non-magical damage. But because my character was a battle master, he was able to use the trip attack. So what that meant was that he was able to knock the enemy prone every round. So you're talking about action economy. Now everybody's got a lot more freedom to move around because the enemy's movement is halved. and anybody who does have the ability to attack with a magical melee weapon is doing so at advantage.
Yeah, the other thing you keep in mind is how cohesive your party is and how well they actually work together in practice. This is something which I will remain salty about until the day I die, at which point I will tell it to my grandchildren. But I had a character years ago, perhaps in the same campaign, though I doubt it, where it was a cleric, and yeah, Ben already knows what I'm going to go on about. I used all 200 gold that you can start with to grab holy water vials, and we were fighting a banshee in the session where that character joined, and the cleric went down because that's what clerics do in reality if the party's not careful. And then the only other healer on the team looked at this thing, this divine being fighting an undead, and said, "You know what? No, I'm not going to heal you. I'm going to cast Vicious Mockery," or whatever it was, on the fucking banshee. And it was just, you have to... My own personal feelings about that aside, from a DMing perspective, if your party is like that, it means they will be significantly less effective if they're all specialized in fighting a different kind of monster if they don't work well together. And at that point, it makes it much easier for challenge ratings to matter and such. So you always have to keep in mind how cohesive your party is so you can create situations like that or avoid them depending on what you're into.
Absolutely. If you've got a bunch of veteran players who really, especially if they've been playing the same characters for a while and really know their characters' abilities and know each other's abilities and know how to make those things work together, then CR is going to be an entirely different conversation than if you have either a bunch of noobs or a bunch of people who are, essentially barbarians who are just swinging every turn and wizards who are just casting fireball every turn regardless of what's actually happening.
Yeah. With that, my thought is that perhaps replace challenge rating with a few different rankings even. This might be unpopular because it brings more stats into D&D and this isn't Pathfinder, but you could have a separate rating for, okay, this is how difficult it is from a party of 3 to 5 people versus a party of 1 to 2 people, or things like that. You could have a different difficulty for, this is how effective it is in an action economy, so that, say, if it summons more monsters like a Jin or a Lich, that's going to be more difficult in the action economy, so you can give it a rating of 10 compared to a zombie, which has a rating of 2. Indeed, this is actually something I've thought on for a while, and while I'm not a fan of Pathfinder's overly extensive rules, I feel like in D&D trying to remain distinctive and separate from Pathfinder, it has gone too far in the opposite direction. We really do need more details on certain things, especially from a DMing perspective. The players might not need a lot of definition, but us DMs, especially if we're using pre-written stuff, we need to know how effective a monster is going to be, and we need information on how that's going to work.
I think also one thing they should do in the monster manuals, especially for the higher level monsters, what would this creature's attack pattern be? How would this creature actually attack? Is it, if it's a vampire alone, what is it doing in order to damage the party? Because if you're not super familiar with the monster and the monster's ability and the monster's spell list, it's easy to play it very wrong. And I guess my closing thought on this is that for the system we have as a DM, I wouldn't ignore CR altogether. But you have to think of it, I would still go back to that base level, a fighter, a rogue, a cleric, and a wizard, and think, okay, how is my party different than that? How is my party stronger or weaker than that? Because if you have a paladin, a rogue with levels in monk, a war domain cleric, and let's say a Bladesinger wizard, that could be a much harder battle for that monster to fight than what is represented by the original 4. And of course, also you get into the things of having more party members and does everybody? My really last thought on it: if everybody in the party has the spell Healing Word, which allows them to bring people back from being downed and do it from a distance, that monster is no longer engaged in D&D. That monster is playing whack-a-mole, and that's going to make the battle a lot harder for the monster.
Yes. My final thought is one last example of just how broken challenge rating is to leave it off on. The Pixie has a challenge rating of 1/4. Not not 14, 1/4. And it has the polymorph spell, which means it can turn into a direwolf. Whereas a Aboleth, I've ran this, so I actually know this, has a challenge rating of 9, if I recall correctly, and it has a health pool of like 50. It will go down very quickly, even with a legendary action. I've DM'd an Aboleth and that happened. So just keep that in mind, that in the current state of the game, a Pixie can legitimately be as much of a threat as an Aboleth, if not more so. And with that...
Okay, hold on. I'm just... you can see into a range of new form and blah, 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 until the target drops to 0. So, alright. So does a direwolf have a 1/4 challenge rating as the Pixie does?
No.
Oh, okay. So we have a slight misreading of that spell, but still... but you know what? Even so...
Poisonous snake, things
yeah,
like
the
that.
Pixie being able to polymorph into something else just blows, just really, it makes it more complicated than it needs to be.
Yeah, and it adds a secondary HP pool like the druids have. So yeah, just again, even a challenge rating 1/4 creature could be as, if not more dangerous than a challenge rating 9 creature. So please keep that in mind whenever you're designing a campaign. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. We'll come at you again with another video soon.